He had spent millions on world-renowned doctors, endless treatments, and the most advanced machines money could buy. Yet nothing had changed. His child remained locked in silence. That silence, heavier than any loss, haunted the grand halls of a mansion perched high in Westlake Hills, Texas. Hi, I'm John Parker, and today's story will touch your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give your like. It's very important to me. And tell me in the comments which city or country you're listening from. Grant Whitaker, once celebrated on the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, had built an empire in technology and finance. But power and wealth could not save him from the emptiness of losing his wife in a tragic accident. At 43, he lived alone in his mansion, his days stripped of glamour, his nights filled with fear. Fear not for his empire, but for the small boy whose silence echoed louder than anything else in his life. Micah, his 6-year-old son, had been diagnosed with autism and Down syndrome. He used a wheelchair, and though his eyes were bright, his lips never formed words. Therapists came and went. Specialists brought new devices, screens, and charts. Grant built therapy rooms filled with colorful toys, sensory equipment, and the latest innovations. Still, Micah sat motionless, his gaze fixed somewhere far away. Grant whispered stories, sang lullabies his late wife once loved, even tried the local traditions, cowboy songs and gentle strums of an old guitar. But his son never replied. Neighbors in Austin whispered about the lonely millionaire with the quiet boy. Some pitied him. Others said money couldn't buy love. And every morning, as the Texas sun rose over Lake Austin, Grant carried Micah to the breakfast table, speaking into the silence as if one day the walls might answer back. But life has a way of introducing unexpected messengers. Her name was June Mercer, a young woman of 27, who carried her own tragedy, a newborn daughter lost before she could even hold her properly. She arrived at the Whitaker mansion not as a therapist, not as a nurse, but as a maid. Someone meant only to clean, cook, and fade into the background. Yet from the moment June stepped into those echoing halls, something subtle shifted. She didn't force conversation with Micah, didn't try to provoke reactions with loud voices or flashing toys. She simply worked quietly near him, humming softly now and then, moving with patience and respect. While others had tried to storm the fortress of Micah's silence, June waited at its gate, still calm, willing to be present. Grant noticed, though he said nothing. He was a man trained to see numbers, to spot the smallest fluctuations in markets. And now he found himself studying the smallest movements in his son, tiny flickers in his fingers, the faint tilt of his head whenever June hummed. They weren't miracles, just shadows of something stirring deep inside. Still, Grant couldn't believe that someone with no degrees, no titles, no grand credentials, might see what millions of dollars in medicine had missed. Yet as the summer heat pressed against the Texas hills, and June quietly folded laundry or wiped down counters, Micah's hands began to twitch toward the sound of running water. His head turned when raindrops slid down the wide glass windows. And once, just once, his lips curved into the faintest smile. Grant's heart froze. For years he had chased breakthroughs in sterile clinics and cold hospitals. Could it be that the key was not in science, but in silence itself? What Grant didn't know was that June's quiet presence was about to reveal secrets buried not only in his son, but in the very system he had trusted. Secrets that would shake his faith in medicine, his trust in others, and his belief in himself as a father. Because sometimes the truth doesn't come wrapped in science. It arrives through the most ordinary soul, carrying extraordinary patience, and this was only the beginning. What June would soon discover in that house would not just change Micah's life, it would uncover a betrayal, darker than Grant had ever imagined. The Whitaker mansion overlooked Lake Austin, its glass walls catching every shimmer of the Texas sun. To the world outside, it looked like paradise, but inside, silence reigned. Every corner, every polished surface, seemed to echo with the absence of a child's laughter. For Grant, the silence had become both enemy and companion, a constant reminder that his millions had built everything except a bridge to his son. Micah's days followed a strict routine. At breakfast, Grant tried to speak casually. "It's a hot one today, buddy," or "Your mama used to love blueberry pancakes," but Micah's eyes stayed distant. Afterward came therapy sessions. Speech therapists with flashcards, occupational therapists with textured toys, music therapists with guitars. They all left defeated. Grant paid them handsomely, yet their optimism always faded into soft apologies. "We did our best, Mr. Whitaker." He would nod, his jaw tight, then walk them out with the same sinking feeling. Money had no voice in Micah's world. But June Mercer didn't arrive with charts or strategies. She swept the marble floors, dusted the leather shelves, and folded linens with quiet determination. She didn't pretend to understand Micah, and she didn't force his attention. She hummed softly while cleaning, her melodies simple and unplanned. At first, Grant barely noticed, yet after several days he caught something, Micah's fingers tapping ever so slightly in rhythm. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was real. One humid afternoon, thunder rolled across the hills. June opened a wide window to let in the scent of rain. As droplets tapped against the stone patio, Micah shifted in his wheelchair. His eyes followed the streaks of water racing down the glass. Grant had never seen him focus so intently. June said nothing. She simply whispered, "You like the rain, don't you, sweetheart?" Her tone wasn't clinical, just gentle, as if she were speaking to her lost daughter. Grant stood in the doorway, astonished. "Did you see that?" he asked. June glanced at him, her voice calm. "He hears it. He feels it. You just have to stop trying so hard and listen with him." For Grant, those words stung. Had he been suffocating his own son with desperation? He thought back to the countless specialists, the experimental treatments, the neurologist Dr. Conrad Huxley with his cold, precise recommendations. Every time Grant had signed the checks, eager to believe someone else held the solution. Yet here was a maid, no degree, no prestige, speaking truths none of the experts had dared to utter. That night Grant couldn't sleep. He replayed the image of Micah's hand twitching to the rhythm of June's humming, his gaze drawn to the rain. It wasn't progress in the medical sense. It was something deeper, an awakening. And he hated to admit it, but it had nothing to do with his fortune. By morning, the silence in the mansion no longer felt the same. It wasn't just emptiness, it was possibility. June continued her quiet routines, but Grant found himself watching her closely. Not in suspicion, but in awe. How could someone who had lost so much carry such gentle strength? Still, he couldn't shake one gnawing thought. If she could see what no one else had, what else might she uncover? Because beneath the polished surface of Micah's medical history lay secrets Grant had never dared to question. And soon June would stumble upon the first crack in that carefully constructed wall. The discovery waiting in his own home would force Grant to confront a betrayal he never saw coming. Grant, Whitaker had always believed he had done everything right. He had hired the best neurologist in Texas, flown in experts from New York and California, even consulted European clinics. Each time the same man reassured him, Dr. Conrad Huxley. With his white coat and calm, authoritative voice, Huxley had convinced Grant that silence was permanent, that Micah would never speak, never connect, never truly live like other children. Grant had trusted him enough to sign papers he barely read, prescriptions filled with complicated names, therapies that seemed more like experiments than care. "We're controlling his impulses," Huxley would say, preventing outbursts. It's for his own safety. And Grant, blinded by grief, desperate for solutions, believed every word. But June Mercer saw things differently. She had no medical training, no prestigious background. What she had was patience and the grief of her own loss. Each day, as she moved quietly through the mansion, she noticed Micah's small reactions. A flutter of his fingers near running water, the way his head tilted when she hummed, his body softening when she sat silently beside him instead of demanding eye contact. One evening, while tidying the office, June found a drawer left slightly ajar. Inside, thick folders stacked neatly. She hesitated. This was not her place, but something drew her in. The folder labeled Micah Whitaker. Medical records seemed to pulse in her hands. She opened it, scanning the dense notes. Her heart sank. Words leapt out. Sedation protocol. Restraint chair. Suppression therapy. Page after page, Dr. Huxley had prescribed medications meant not to heal but to control. Reports described Micah as non-compliant, emotionally disruptive, requiring firm management. June's hands trembled. This wasn't care, it was cruelty disguised as science. Later that night, as the house lay quiet, June sat at her small desk in the servants' quarters. Her eyes filled with tears. No wonder, she whispered to herself. No wonder he hides inside himself. They taught him that silence was safer than pain. She thought of her own daughter, of how she had prayed for just one more cry, one more heartbeat. The contrast cut through her like glass. Micah still had a voice. It had simply been buried under years of misguided treatments. The next morning, June couldn't keep it inside. She found Grant in his office, staring at financial reports he barely read. She held the folder in her hands. "Mr. Whitaker," she said carefully, "you need to see this." Grant looked up, irritation flashing. "Those are private records." "Why are you—" He stopped when he saw the look in her eyes. "Pain, urgency, truth." He opened the folder and began to read. His face drained of color. His hand clenched the paper until it crumpled. Line after line confirmed it. The man he had trusted had been dosing his son into silence, dear God. Grant whispered, his voice breaking. "All these years, I thought I was helping him. I thought that he couldn't finish." He pressed his palms to his eyes, trembling, as guilt washed over him. June placed a hand on the desk, her voice steady. "This isn't your fault. You trusted someone you thought knew better. But you need to know the truth now, because Micah doesn't need control. He needs to be heard." For the first time in years, Grant felt the ground beneath him shift, not because of business losses or market crashes, but because the foundation of his trust had been shattered. And deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. If Dr. Huxley had betrayed him in this way, what else had been hidden in the shadows of his son's silence? The summer sun blazed over Westlake Hills, turning the mansion's stone patio into a sheet of light. June Mercer wheeled Micah into the backyard, past trimmed hedges and the sprawling garden, toward the pool that shimmered like liquid glass. Grant followed at a distance, still reeling from the betrayal he had uncovered in Dr. Huxley's records. Guilt gnawed at him, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He needed to see, needed to believe, that his son was more than a prisoner of silence. June knelt beside Micah's chair. "Do you hear it?" she whispered, as the gentle hum of the pool's filter filled the air. Micah's eyes flickered. His fingers moved, faint but deliberate. June smiled softly, dipping her hand into the water and letting droplets fall back in slow rhythm. Micah tilted his head, lips parting slightly as if tasting the sound. Grant froze. For years he had begged for reactions, hired experts to provoke responses with flashing lights and loud sounds. Yet here was his son, drawn not to noise but to the music of water. June glanced at Grant. "Let's try something," she murmured. She placed a bright yellow float vest around Micah's small frame, fastening the straps with steady hands. "You're safe," she whispered to him, as though speaking to her lost daughter through him. With cautious movements, she lifted him into the shallow edge of the pool, her arms wrapped firmly around him. At first, Micah's body stiffened. His shoulders tensed, his arms jerked in resistance. Grant stepped forward, panic flaring. "Stop, he's not ready!" But then it happened. Micah's body loosened. His hands slid across the surface of the water. His breathing slowed. And then, as June slowly rocked him in the gentle rhythm of the pool, a sound escaped his lips. A laugh, quick and soft, but real. Grant staggered. His knees nearly buckled. He hadn't heard that sound since his wife was alive. It pierced through him, cracking the walls of guilt and despair. Tears blurred his vision. June's own eyes filled as she whispered, "You see? He's still here. He just needed to feel safe." Micah's small laugh turned into a quiet hum. His hands tapped the water, splashing lightly. Then, in a moment that would brand itself on Grant's soul forever, the boy turned his head, locked eyes with his father, and whispered one single word. "Dad," Grant gasped. The world collapsed and reformed in an instant. He fell to his knees by the pool's edge, tears streaming freely. "I'm here, Micah, I'm here, son." His voice broke, raw with years of longing. He reached out, and Micah's small fingers brushed his trembling hand. The silence that had tormented the Whitaker mansion cracked open like thunder. Inside that single word lay all the years of love, hope, and connection that Grant thought were lost forever. But as overwhelming as that moment was, another truth weighed heavy on his chest. If one word could emerge after years of silence, what else had been stolen from his child by the negligence and betrayal of a trusted doctor? Grant knew then that the fight was no longer only about unlocking Micah's voice. It was about exposing the system that had silenced him, and the war for justice was about to begin. The echo of that single word, Dad, still reverberated through Grant Whitaker's chest. It was a miracle, but it was also a curse because it proved beyond doubt that his son had been capable all along. Capable of connection, of laughter, of words. What crushed him was knowing that years of heavy medications and cold therapies had buried that possibility under sedation and silence. That night, Grant sat in his study with the folder of records spread across his desk. Each page felt like a knife. Clinical notes, checklists, and dosages scribbled with precision. Maintain sedation levels. Limit stimulation. Nonverbal prognosis confirmed. These weren't the words of healing, they were chains, shackling his son to a diagnosis that was never fully understood. June stood in the doorway, hesitant, her hands clasped tightly. "Mr. Whitaker." "Grant," she corrected herself softly. "You didn't fail him. You trusted a man who wore the mask of knowledge. That's not failure, that's betrayal." Grant's head fell into his hands. "I signed everything. I let him treat Micah like an experiment. God help me, I let them silence my boy." His voice cracked raw with regret. June stepped closer, her voice steady though her heart ached. "What matters now is what you do with the truth. You have money, influence, and you're not alone anymore." Grant lifted his eyes, red and weary. "What do you mean?" "I mean," June whispered, "we fight for him. We fight for every child that man has silenced." The idea planted itself like a seed in Grant's mind. For years he had used his power to build empires. Now for the first time he saw another use for it: justice. The following week Grant and June began digging. June spent late nights on the old family computer, cross-referencing Dr. Huxley's name. What she uncovered made her blood run cold. Lawsuits quietly dismissed. Families who had spoken of strange side effects. Whispers on online forums from parents who had trusted him and regretted it. One post in particular struck June. "He told us our son would never speak. He kept him drugged for years. When we finally left his care, our boy said his first word 3 months later." Grant slammed his fist on the desk when she showed him. "This isn't negligence. This is systemic abuse." June nodded. "And we're not the only ones." With trembling resolve, Grant reached out to an old acquaintance, Avery Cole, a lawyer known in Austin for tackling impossible cases. They met in the Whitaker mansion, files spread across the dining table where silence used to reign. Avery's sharp eyes scanned each page, his jaw tightening. "You realize," Avery said, "this isn't just about malpractice. If these reports are true, Huxley could lose his license. Maybe even face prison." Grant leaned forward, his voice low, almost feral. "Then let's make sure he does." June placed a hand gently on the table. "But it's not only about punishment, it's about truth. Families deserve to know they weren't alone, that they weren't crazy for believing their children had more inside them." Grant looked at her, something shifting between them. For the first time, he didn't just see her as the maid who had brought laughter back into his home. He saw her as a partner, an ally, someone who had stepped into his world of marble, flaws and silence, and dared to demand justice for a boy who couldn't. But in the shadows of Austin's elite medical community, rumors were already spreading. Dr. Huxley had powerful friends, and whispers of the Whitakers' defiance would not go unanswered, because the moment you challenge a man who built his career on silencing children, you risk awakening enemies who thrive in the dark. News traveled quickly in Austin's medical circles. The whispers began as soon as word leaked that Grant Whitaker, the reclusive millionaire who had once been the golden client of Dr. Conrad Huxley, was asking too many questions. It started with subtle warnings. An anonymous letter slipped under the mansion's front gate. "Careful where you dig, Whitaker. Some stones are best left unturned." Phone calls in the dead of night, silence on the other end, then a click. June noticed unmarked cars parked too long across the street. Grant wasn't easily intimidated. He had stared down Wall Street titans, negotiated billion-dollar deals in glass towers where one wrong move meant ruin. But this was different. This wasn't about money, it was about his son. Still, the threat was real. Avery Cole, their lawyer, laid it out clearly. Huxley isn't just any doctor. He's connected. Universities, research boards, pharmaceutical companies. If we go after him, we'll be fighting an entire system. Are you ready for that? Grant's jaw tightened. I wasn't ready to watch my son's childhood disappear in silence either. I've wasted enough years. June sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his. We're not backing down. But the battle wasn't only outside, it was inside Grant as well. Guilt had rooted itself deep. At night, he'd pace the mansion halls, haunted by the image of Micah drugged into stillness while he signed paper after paper. June often found him in the study, staring at old photos of his late wife. I promised her I'd protect him, he whispered once, his voice raw. Instead, I handed him over to wolves. June leaned close, her own eyes shimmering. And now you're keeping that promise. You're saving him in the only way that matters, by giving him back his voice. It was during one of those long nights that Micah, from his wheelchair, surprised them again. June had been reading a picture book aloud, her voice soft against the hum of cicadas outside. She pointed to a bright yellow duck. Micah lifted his hand, tapped the page, and whispered, "Duck." The word was faint, broken, but undeniable. Grant's breath caught. He dropped to his knees beside his son. "Say it again, buddy, please." Micah looked at him, tapped the duck, and repeated stronger this time. "Duck." Grant broke down. June hugged Micah from the side, her tears falling on the boy's hair. This was more than progress, it was proof. Micah had been buried alive under years of drugs and restraints, but he was still here, still fighting. The next morning, fueled by this breakthrough, Grant and June went public. With Nora Keaton, the investigative journalist, they opened their doors. Cameras captured the mansion's therapy rooms, stacks of medical files, and the quiet boy who was slowly finding his voice. Nora's article, published in the Austin American-Statesman, carried a headline that ignited outrage. Millionaire's son silenced by medicine, the hidden practices of Dr. Conrad Huxley. The city buzzed. Parents began calling, emailing, writing letters. Stories poured in, similar patterns of sedation, of children reduced to shadows. Avery's office filled with testimonies, but power never surrenders quietly. Within days, Huxley appeared on television, composed and confident. "These accusations are not only false, they are dangerous," he declared. "The Whitaker boy's condition is severe and irreversible. To suggest otherwise gives false hope." His words dripped with arrogance, his smile cold. Grant watched the broadcast, fury burning through him. June stood at his side, her hand steady on his arm. "He's lying to save himself," she whispered. Grant nodded, his eyes locked on the screen. "Then we'll tear down every lie, piece by piece." What neither of them knew was that the deeper they pushed, the closer they were to uncovering a truth that would rock not just Austin, but the entire country. The courthouse in downtown Austin loomed like a fortress of stone and glass. On the morning of the first hearing, the steps overflowed with cameras, reporters shouting questions and parents clutching photos of their children. For years, Dr. Conrad Huxley had been revered, a man of science respected on hospital boards, celebrated at medical conferences. But now, under the harsh glare of public scrutiny, his empire trembled. Grant Whitaker arrived in a tailored navy suit, his face pale but resolute. At his side, June Mercer pushed Micah's wheelchair. The boy wore a simple white shirt and clutched his favorite yellow toy duck. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing the unlikely trio, the millionaire, the maid, and the child whose silence had ignited a storm. Inside the courtroom, Avery Cole presented evidence with relentless precision. He laid out charts of prescriptions, highlighted medical notes that spoke more of compliance than care. One page read, "Patient resists verbal engagement. Increased sedation." Another, "Nonverbal prognosis. Family advised not to expect speech." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Parents exchanged knowing looks, some weeping silently. Nora Keaton, seated with her notepad, scribbled furiously. This was more than a case, it was a reckoning. Dr. Huxley sat at the defense table, his silver hair perfectly combed, his hands folded calmly. When called to testify, he leaned into the microphone with practiced authority. "These accusations are the result of grief and misunderstanding. I have dedicated my career to helping children like young Micah. Any medications prescribed were standard, any therapies conducted with the utmost care." Grant's fists clenched under the table. June placed her hand over his, whispering, "Let Avery handle him." The cross-examination came like a blade. Avery confronted Huxley with testimonies from other families. stories of children who had been restrained, sedated, their development stunted. "Doctor, are you saying every single one of these parents is lying?" Avery demanded. Huxley's calm mask faltered for the first time. His answer, cold, dismissive, only deepened the jury's unease. But the most powerful testimony came not from experts or lawyers. It came from June. She took the stand, her voice steady but full of emotion. She spoke of the first time she saw Micah's fingers twitch to the sound of running water, of the moment he laughed in the pool, of the day he whispered, "Dad." She described the files she found, the chilling notes, the truth no one had dared to confront. Her words painted a picture not of a diagnosis, but of a child who had been silenced by those sworn to help him. And then, in a moment that hushed the entire courtroom, Avery wheeled Micah forward. The boy looked around nervously, his small hands gripping the duck. June knelt beside him. "Show them, sweetheart," she whispered. Micah tapped the duck and said clearly, "Duck." The sound, though simple, carried the weight of years of silence, shattered. The courtroom erupted, some gasping, others crying openly. Even the judge's eyes softened. Grant buried his face in his hands, overcome. This was not just evidence. It was proof that everything Dr. Huxley had claimed was a lie. As reporters scribbled and cameras flashed, Grant realized something profound. This battle was no longer just about Micah. It was about every child whose voice had been buried under the weight of arrogance and greed. And though the verdict was still to come, the tide had turned. But the cost of truth is never cheap, and the Whitakers were about to discover just how high the price of justice could be. The trial dragged on for weeks. Each day the courthouse filled with parents, journalists, and advocates. Some drove in from Houston, Dallas, even as far as Oklahoma, clutching thick folders of their own medical records. They whispered in the hallways, their stories eerily similar to Grant's: sedation, restraints, silence. What had once been a private fight became a movement, but with every step forward, the resistance grew fiercer. One evening, as June returned from the grocery store, she found the tires of her old sedan slashed in the driveway. A crude note was tucked under the wiper. "Stay out of matters you don't understand." Grant's security detail doubled after that. But the message was clear. The closer they came to victory, the more dangerous the fight became. Still, nothing could stop the momentum now. Nora Keaton's investigative series spread across national outlets. Headlines screamed, "Children silenced, the dark legacy of Dr. Conrad Huxley." Millionaire father and maid turn whistleblowers. Grant hated the attention, but he endured it. He no longer cared about his reputation in Austin's business circles. The only legacy he wanted was for his son to be heard. Inside the mansion, life changed in quiet but profound ways. Micah began making more sounds, simple words that felt like treasures. Ball, book, blue. June logged each one in a worn leather journal, her handwriting neat and careful. Grant often sat with her in the evenings, reading the entries aloud as though reciting scripture. "You're giving him back to me," Grant told her once, his voice rough. Piece by piece, June shook her head gently. "He was always here. We just needed to listen." But while Micah blossomed, Grant's own demons deepened. Late at night, he'd stand at the edge of the pool staring at the rippling water. His reflection looked like a stranger, haunted, older, weighed down. "If I'd questioned Huxley sooner," he whispered one night, "Micah might have spoken years ago. He might have laughed with his mother before she died." The guilt gnawed at him like an open wound. June found him there, her voice low but steady. "Grant, guilt keeps you chained to the past. But Micah needs you here now. He doesn't remember silence as punishment. He remembers who stayed by his side. And that's you." Her words softened him, though the ache never fully left. The trial neared its climax. Avery Cole presented damning evidence. Financial ties between Dr. Huxley and pharmaceutical companies, payments that coincided with the highest doses prescribed to children. The jury listened in stunned silence. Huxley's once impenetrable facade cracked. His hands trembled as he tried to maintain composure, but the defense struck back hard. They painted Grant as a desperate millionaire blinded by grief, and June as a grieving maid clinging to someone else's child to fill the void of her own loss. The words cut deep, especially for June. She left the courtroom one afternoon, tears streaking her cheeks, whispering, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just—" Replacing her, Grant followed, his voice urgent. "No, you're not replacing anyone. You're giving my son something he's never had. Someone who sees him as more than a diagnosis. That's not weakness, June. That's love." The two stood in the courthouse corridor, their pain mingling, their purpose hardening. The bond between them was no longer employer and maid, no longer even allies in a fight. It was something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. As they returned to the courtroom, the stakes were clear. The verdict would not only decide Huxley's fate, it would decide if Micah's story became a beacon of hope or just another tragedy buried under wealth and power. And just when it seemed victory was within reach, an unexpected revelation threatened to turn everything upside down. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Avery Cole prepared to introduce his final witness. Everyone expected another parent, another heartbreaking testimony. But instead, a tall woman with iron-gray hair stepped forward. She adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat, and introduced herself as Dr. Evelyn Cross, a former colleague of Conrad Huxley. The room fell silent. "I worked alongside Dr. Huxley for 12 years, she began, her voice trembling but resolute. "And I can no longer remain quiet." She described how Huxley had pressured staff to falsify progress reports, how children were over-medicated not for care, but to maintain compliance during clinical trials funded by pharmaceutical companies. "These children were not patients to him," she declared. "They were data points." Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Nora Keaton's pen flew across her notebook. Grant's jaw clenched, and June's hand tightened around Micah's wheelchair. But then Dr. Cross said something that made Grant's blood run cold. "One of those children was Micah Whitaker. I warned Dr. Huxley that the drugs he prescribed could suppress speech and motor function. He told me, 'The father is too blinded by money and grief to ask questions. He'll sign whatever we give him.'" Grant staggered back in his chair as if struck. The courtroom erupted, the judge pounding her gavel for silence. But the damage was done. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was personal. June reached for his arm. "Grant!" He shook his head, eyes burning. "He knew. He knew all along, and I let him." The defense scrambled, trying to discredit Dr. Cross, but her documentation was ironclad. Emails, memos, internal reports. Avery moved swiftly, presenting them to the jury. Each page painted the same picture, corruption hidden under the guise of medicine. That evening, back at the mansion, Grant sat alone in the study, staring at the fire. "I was a fool," he whispered. "I spent millions chasing hope while my boy suffered in silence." June entered quietly, Micah asleep in her arms. She placed the child gently on the couch, then sat across from Grant. "You weren't a fool. You were a father who trusted. And now you're a father who fights." Her words cut through the darkness. Grant looked at her, seeing not just the maid who had entered his home, but the woman who had rebuilt it brick by brick with patience and love. For the first time, he allowed himself to speak the thought that had lingered in the shadows of his heart. "June, maybe this was never about me saving Micah. Maybe it was about Micah saving me." June's eyes filled with tears. She reached for his hand, squeezing it firmly. "Then let's make sure his voice saves others too." The next day, the prosecution delivered its closing arguments, but the jury no longer needed convincing. The evidence was overwhelming. What no one expected, however, was the judge's decision to fast-track the verdict given the national attention. The courtroom braced itself as the jury foreman stood, paper trembling in his hands, and in that suspended breath, the fate of Conrad Huxley and the future of the Whitaker family hung in the balance. The jury foreman's voice rang out, every syllable cutting through the hushed courtroom. "We find the defendant, Dr. Conrad Huxley, guilty on all counts." A collective gasp erupted, followed by muffled sobs and spontaneous applause. Parents who had carried their children's photos clutched them tighter, whispering prayers of relief. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras flashing like lightning. For years Huxley had hidden behind his reputation, his degrees, his white coat. Now, stripped of it all, he sat pale and trembling, his empire collapsing with a single word: guilty. Grant's hands shook as he reached for June. Tears streamed down his face, not of guilt this time, but of release. June gripped his hand tightly, her eyes glistening as she whispered, "It's over." But in truth, it wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. In the weeks that followed, The Whitaker mansion transformed again. No longer a mausoleum of silence, it became a home alive with color and sound. Micah laughed often now, sometimes splashing water in the pool with June, sometimes tapping at picture books with his small fingers. His words came slowly but steadily. Blue, sound, book, love. Each one a treasure, each one proof that the boy once buried in silence had always been waiting to be heard. Grant invested his millions not into sterile therapies, but into creating a foundation, the Whitaker Trust for Children's Voices, a program dedicated to supporting families silenced by corrupt systems. Journalists hailed him not as the businessman who lost everything to grief, but as the father who turned betrayal into redemption. And June. She was no longer the maid. She became Micah's guardian in every sense of the word. The bond between her and the boy deepened daily. One afternoon, as they painted in the art studio Grant had built, Micah held up a drawing of 3 stick figures, one tall, one with long hair, one small with a bright yellow duck. He pointed to each figure, saying softly, "Dad, Mom, me." The word Mom froze June where she sat. She covered her mouth, tears spilling over while Grant's throat tightened with gratitude. Micah had chosen. He had given her a name that no court order could bestow, no title could replace. That night, at a community ceremony honoring survivors and families, Micah walked slowly onto the stage in a crisp navy suit, holding June's hand. The audience rose to their feet, applauding. He stood at the microphone, his voice unsteady but clear. "My light began at the pool." Then he pointed at June and Grant. "Family." The crowd wept, their applause thunderous. And in that moment, every scar, every sleepless night, every whispered fear was redeemed. Grant, seated in the front row, whispered to himself, "I thought I was teaching him to speak. But he's been teaching me to listen all along. The story of the millionaire, the maid, and the child who broke free from silence became more than a headline, it became a legacy. And before we close, let me leave you with this. I'm John Parker, and remember, every story hides a truth. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, your city, your country. Don't forget to subscribe so these stories can reach more hearts around the world, because sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones we almost never heard."